Day of Remembrance. The Day of Remembrance is to remind us of the significance of February 19th, as it was on this day in 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which gave U.S. Army the authority to remove Americans of Japanese ancestry from the military zones established in Washington, Oregon, and California, which meant that many Japanese American civilians were forced to abandon their jobs, their homes, and their livelihoods to be sent to concentration camps in the remote regions of the country. No Japanese American was ever charged, much less convicted, of espionage or sabotage, which they were fearing, but they were still targeted by the community of their own country. So we are honored to have with us today, Frank Abe. Frank Abe has made great contributions to the Asian American community to educate and inform about Asian American history and issues through all forms of media, such as films, books, symposiums, just to name a few. He's also served 25 years as a communications director for someone you should really know by now as a Bellevue College student, Gary Locke. So we have quite a connection here. He is currently focusing his time as an author, having released the new graphic novel, We Hereby Refuse, which I have one right here. And to some of you who have registered, you are going to get one very soon. And for those who haven't, we still have books to give out. So if you have the chance, you can check it out. We'll send you a link in the chat later. So this is a very exciting book. And without further ado, welcome, Frank Abe.
Thank you very much, Sunny, for inviting me to speak here today. You mentioned all the platforms that I've been involved with, documentary film, academic book on John Okada, this graphic novel. As students, I just want you to know that I stumbled into each one of these things simply because I had a story to tell, which is basically the story I'll tell you today. And I kind of just got it done in different mediums without really knowing, kind of learning on the job, as it were. So I'm now a documentary filmmaker, but I had to learn how to do it by simply making the film. And also a correction, I was Gary Locke's communications director when he was King County executive for 3 years, not 25 years. But I spent 25 years staying on in county government as a result. So I really am indebted to Gary for that. So, Sonny, when you invited me to speak today, one of the questions you raised was that of loyalty, of how loyalty to this country is measured and who defines it, and how immigrants of a non-white race can so easily fall under the suspicion of being disloyal. We also discussed, you and I, the resurgence of anti-Asian violence that we're seeing, whether you're walking down the street here or taking the subway in New York. Some of us, still feel targeted for the way that we look. It made it feel like we don't belong. Still the foreigner, still the other. So these are questions that I want to address today through the lens of the graphic novel that our team created under a commission from the Wigluck Museum in Seattle, and see if we can find connections between this history from 80 years ago and the things that you all are seeing and experiencing today. And I'm going to share my screen here because I have some things to show you. I want to start with my personal story. My father, immigrant from Japan, basically sent here by his family to make his own life in America. He was put to work as a field worker in San Jose, California. He was 16 when Japan attacked the US to start World War II. And he was 17 when President Roosevelt signed the executive order, as you say, 80 years ago this week, that authorized the removal of my father and 120,000 other persons of Japanese ancestry. So he was sent to a camp in Wyoming called Heart Mountain, and that's him standing on the far left with the mess hall crew. The question is, what did my father do to deserve this? And the answer is nothing. His only crime was his race. Anyone with 1/16 Japanese blood was rounded up and taken away. No hearing, no due process, no equal protection under the law. And the same was true for the three characters in We Hereby Refuse. They did nothing to deserve this, except they took things a step further and pushed back against the government that they felt betrayed them. Jim Okutsu of Seattle refused to be drafted from a camp in Idaho, the Minidoka camp. Mitsuya Endo of Sacramento lent her name to a habeas corpus petition against illegal detention that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And Hiroshi Kashiwagi of Sacramento refuses to sign a loyalty questionnaire after the government had taken everything away from him and Japanese America. So before the war, like my father, each of these characters were no different from any other idealistic American kid about the age of the students, who are here in this room, right? They were all ready and willing to serve their country in any way if called upon. So I'm going to take let's take each of their stories in turn. Jim Okutsu of Seattle tried to enlist in the army 2 or 3 times before the war, but was rejected because of his flat feet. Jim is shocked to come home and find his father being taken away by the FBI soon after Pearl Harbor. His father was just a cobbler, shoe repairman, not a business leader or a Buddhist priest like many of those who were arrested on December 8th. Their father was held at the immigration detention station down on Airport Way in Seattle. From there, he and others were put on a train for the Department of Justice alien internment camp at Fort Missoula, Montana. And here on the right, you can see the outstretched arms of the wives and children screaming out their goodbyes in Japanese and English. The men wonder if they would ever see their families again. Jim's family is bused to the Puyallup Fairgrounds. You've all been there for the county fair, right? They're held there at the Puyallup Assembly Center while waiting for construction of the more permanent incarceration camp at Minidoka, Idaho. So what happens is the War Department, while they're in camp, reinstitutes the draft, selective service for the Nisei in camp. And for Jim and his brother Gene, there is no question. They argue they've never done anything against the US government. They are loyal to the country of their birth, and yet they're being treated as if they were the enemy. So they refuse to report for induction, not because they're afraid to fight or against the war. They refuse to serve until their rights are first restored and their families freed to go home, back to Seattle. They insist on being treated as loyal Americans before performing the duties of a loyal American. So this is a very daring move. They try and get a test case into court, taken to jail in Boise, Idaho, where they're tried for draft evasion. Judge refuses to allow the jury to consider any of the moral or constitutional questions that Jim and the others raise. The jury takes only a few minutes to go out, smoke a cigarette before coming back in a few minutes to return verdicts of guilty. Really is kind of a kangaroo court. The young men are sentenced to 3 years and 3 months at McNeil Island, which, as you know, is west of Tacoma. They aren't released until 1946, well after everyone has been released from the camps or returned from the war. And for the rest of their lives, Jim and Gene and the other draft resistors are shunned by the Japanese American community for challenging the government on this question of loyalty. Let's move on to the story of Mitsuya Endo in our book. She was a key punch operator for the Department of Employment in California. After Pearl Harbor, the California Personnel Board suspended all employees of Japanese ancestry on suspicion of their loyalty. Same thing happened here in Seattle with the Seattle School Board and the school teachers. They're suspended, fired. Endo was one of 63 state employees, though, who organized and hired Attorney James Purcell to contest their termination from their jobs. These civil service jobs, mind you, were very valuable because they had, well, as staff here probably knows, you have civil service protections and good benefits. And so they valued their jobs. But in the middle of their case, the Army evicts all Japanese Americans, of course, from Sacramento on the West Coast, and Endo is bused to the Sacramento Assembly Center, former migrant labor camp. Their attorney, James Purcell, identifies her as the perfect plaintiff for a different kind of case, not an employment case, but he has an idea of doing a habeas corpus case to challenge the government's ability to indefinitely imprison American citizens like Mitsuye who are admittedly loyal US citizens. And Endo is reluctant at first, but she shakes hands to signal her agreement to be the named plaintiff. Lawyers for the War Relocation Authority fear the strength of her case and sent its chief solicitor to offer her a chance to leave camp, which would make her case moot. Because the deal is if she's no longer held in camp, the case gets dismissed. So this person, Endo, she's in her early 20s, right? She can do what's best for herself or what's best for the good of all. And what she says is, I'm willing to go as far as I can on this case. For her, it means staying in camp in Topaz for 2 full years more, until her case finally reaches the US Supreme Court. And there the court rules the Roosevelt administration had no legal right for the long-term imprisonment of admittedly loyal US citizens. And she gets the telegram, does a little happy dance to celebrate victory. Now, the third story in our novel is that of Hiroshi Kashiwagi. And let me spend a bit more time with him because his story is a very complex one, and it's one that cuts to the very question of loyalty that we're kind of circling around. And this is a story that is so misrepresented and misunderstood even today by members of the Japanese American community. Hiroshi was just 2 years out of high school, helping his family sharecrop on a fruit ranch outside Sacramento, waiting to go to college. First removed to the Marysville Assembly Center, then brought by train to Tule Lake on the California-Oregon border. Now, at first, Tule Lake is just one of 10 war relocation centers like Minidoka or Heart Mountain, no different from the others. And Hiroshi wasn't there long, and before the needs of 2 different government agencies come together in a catastrophic bureaucratic bungle over the question of loyalty, and this bungling divides Japanese America forever. First, as you probably know, many young Nisei men, again about your age, wanted a way to prove that they were just as American as everyone else by volunteering for the army in the fight against fascism. Want to go fight Hitler. The community leaders of the JACL, the Japanese American Citizens League, led the call for the army to admit the Nisei into the armed services. The problem here is the army, having effectively branded the Japanese in America as untrustworthy or disloyal by locking them up in these camps, now needs a reverse PR campaign to clear the volunteers as eligible for service in the army. By the same token, the Civilian War Relocation Authority, their mission is to eventually relocate families into homes and jobs in the East and Midwest, away from the West Coast. But it too needs some way to clear them for resettlement into places like Oberlin, Ohio, or New York City. And people in Oberlin, they're suspicious of the government moving in young Nisei men and women into their colleges or their jobs there, because after all, they were locked up on the West Coast. They must have done something wrong to deserve that. They're suspicious to us. So the Army and the WRA come up with what for them is the perfect paper trail, a loyalty oath. And I have to say, after working in government for 25 years, I kind of understand the bureaucratic thinking. And working in the college administration, you probably understand the same thing. A paper trail is a way to cover your ass. And the Army and WRA combine their questions onto one form. And it's the last 2 questions that are tricky ones, and you can see them there on the page. Question 27, are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered? 28, will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the U.S. from any and all attacks from foreign domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor? Now, the Army and WRA think these are very simple questions, no one have any problem, cool. And they send out the questionnaire to camps. But many in camp were thrown into panic. and they said, if you'd asked me these questions before you took away my home, my business, my farm, and before you locked me up here, sure, I would have probably said yes, no problem. But by this time, 1 year into the war and their imprisonment, Hiroshi Kashiwagi and many others are just fed up with the government, fed up with JCL, continually demanding that they prove their loyalty. And Hiroshi refuses the pressure to sign the loyalty oath, especially when no one, not even the camp administration, knows the consequences of a yes or no answer. As Hiroshi wrote in one of his plays, I'm sick of saying yes to everything. Yes, I'll go to camp. Yes, I'll serve in the army. Yes, I'll declare my loyalty. I'll prove my loyalty by standing for my rights as an American. So Hiroshi holds fast and refuses to sign the questionnaire. It was only after the threat of 5 years in prison and a $10,000 fine, a penalty that in fact was invented by officials and in fact not true, that Hiroshi was compelled to write down no and no to those two questions. 12,000 people, 1 out of every 10 Japanese Americans in camp answered no in some form of those questions. So this was a very substantial form of resistance. Now, what does this do? All this application, this loyalty questionnaire does is create a class, an administrative class of people who on paper have to be categorized as not loyal when they refuse to answer or answer no to the question, are you loyal? Please keep in mind, these people have committed no acts of disloyalty. They've planted no bombs. They've sent no plans, no military plans to Tokyo. All they've done is put down answers under threat of prison time and stiff fines on a poorly misunderstood questionnaire for, again, which no one has any idea of the consequences. What the consequence was, that was even unknown at the time to the people, was that the WRA would take these forms and use them to sort them into 2 piles, yes and no. The government's very binary, yes and no, very simple to understand, easy to process. Congress pressures the WRA to segregate the no's from the yeses. We got to separate, the rotten apples, right? Take out from the good ones. And the JCL, our community leadership, is demanding protection for their loyalists who are getting beaten up in camp for collaborating with the government. So the agency obliges by fortifying Tule Lake as its segregation center and moves in those 12,000 from all the camps who answered no or refused to answer, whose names are in the no pile, right? Moves them into Tule Lake and moves out 6,000 people. A lot refuse to leave. They just don't want to move anymore. WRA adds more watchtowers, double man-proof fence, builds a military stockade to hold inmate leaders. So now they have a prison inside a prison. And what makes this the story of camp as you've never seen it before, is that we examine the shop-worn label of disloyalty and kind of turn it on its head. As several Tulians said at the time, it's not a question of our loyalty, folks. It's the country that's not loyal to us, to its own principles, not loyal to the Constitution. It's government expediency that creates a class of disloyals, not the targets, not the incarcerees. And again, the government creates a class of disloyals through a purely bureaucratic act. It's only disloyalty on paper and not action. And under the law, you can't be prosecuted for your thoughts, only for your actions. This shows you that suspicion of disloyalty, false accusations of loyalty have historically been made solely on the basis of race. It's part of a long American tradition to continue framing the Nisei as disloyal. During this time, members of Congress have been trying to strip the Nisei of their U.S. citizenship and deport them all to Japan, and send them back. Very, very easy populist cry. Congress is told that the 14th Amendment to the Constitution guarantees birthright citizenship to anyone who's born on U.S. soil. So in July of 1944, Congress finds a way around the Constitution. It passes the Denaturalization Act, here called denationalization, but Denaturalization Act, which for the first time enables a U.S. citizen to voluntarily surrender their citizenship during time of war. And the beauty, if you will, of this idea is that why pass a law that will be overturned as unconstitutional when you can get the angry, frustrated, and confused people in these camps to voluntarily renounce their citizenship? And many families in camp walk into this trap, including the family of Hiroshi Kashiwagi. Hiroshi immediately regrets his decision, desperately tries to withdraw it, but he can't. And our story shows how this change from a relocation camp to segregation center create the conditions for unrest at Tule Lake. Tule Lake is converted, as I say, to a high security prison. And where you have a prison, you inevitably create prison gangs with pressures for repatriation to Japan, expatriation, denationalization, renunciation, and ultimately deportation. The 18,000 people pushed into the segregation center can see how this government has abandoned or turned against them, and all they have left is literally their own skin, their own ancestry. And so they have to find pride and strength in something, and that is their racial ancestry. Anger and frustration, isolation, boil over into organization. Now, these are the so-called pro-Japan fanatics you may have heard about at Tule Lake. Our book shows, when you read it, how these groups were a product of the duress of mass incarceration and segregation. After all, just stop and think, was there a Back to Japan movement before the mass eviction from Seattle and Bellevue? No. As one young man put it, for the first time, I feel good about being Japanese in Tule Lake because it's all he has left. And it's an environment that 7 of every 10 Nisei at Tule Lake voluntarily surrender the U.S. citizenship, including Hiroshi Kashiwagi. He caves to family pressure to renounce his citizenship. They act under duress from the government and coercion from gangs, the government knowingly allowed to run wild, with only rumor and misinformation to guide them. And as one character says, how convenient for the government to give us the chance to self-deport. And we walked right into the trap. Into this turmoil walks San Francisco attorney named Wayne Collins. Hiroshi and others recruit him to take on their renunciation cases. He wins a stay of deportation for Hiroshi. He advises the group, you can no more resign citizenship in time of war than you can resign from the human race. And he points out that they renounce under the duress of 2 years of false imprisonment. And again, the physical coercion from gangs in camp that the government allows to run wild. On the spot, Collins scrawls a sample letter to the Attorney General for the people to copy and pass around and start the process of withdrawing their renunciations. Little does he know that he'd be spending the next 10 years of his life single-handedly fighting the Justice Department on behalf of the renunciants to restore citizenship to Hiroshi and 5,000 others who had renounced. Hiroshi Kashiwagi returns after the war to Sacramento, bright sunny day, only to find that old friends in Tule Lake ignoring and ostracizing him with the term "no-no boy" used as a slur. And what disturbs me personally the most is how people in my Japanese American community embraced these labels of troublemaker, disloyal, pro-Japan, and no-no boy without seeing how these divisions were created not just by the war, but by the actions of the government to sort people into two piles and label and yes as yes and no. And again, we bought right into that and keep it alive today. So race was at issue in World War II, and race continues to divide us today. Let me just wrap up by showing how we made the leap from past to present in the graphic novel by reading from the final pages. So the book ends with Hiroshi Kashiwagi working after the war in San Francisco as a librarian at the city's public library, describing how Wayne Collins won back the citizenship that he had renounced. After 35 years, can you imagine my chagrin, my dismay, when I learned that there was no law that required draft age Nisei to answer that loyalty questionnaire in camp? All those threats of prison and fines, all lies. I was angry all over again. At least I'm able to unburden myself with others who were cast out from our own community. Even to this day, to be an American is a privilege I appreciate. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that America must unburden itself too. The government was wrong to single us out for exclusion based solely on our race. It was wrong then, and it would be wrong now. And whenever we see America turn against the people because of their race or their religion or their whatever, we won't just stand by. We won't just go along. I will speak up. I will see that every person gets a fair hearing. I will be the friend we didn't have when we needed one the most. It happened to us. We refuse to let it happen again. Now, if those words in that banner, never again is now, sound familiar to you, it may be because you've seen them on campus every day for the last 2 years, right? It's been 2 years since AAPI faculty, staff, and students brought Aaron Chigaki's mural, Never Again Is Now, to the courtyard. And those poor kids, I understand from Leslie that those poor kids are still standing there on the brick wall waiting for the bus to pick them up and take them to incarceration camp. Even though it was defaced by a vice president and ordered removed by another administrator. So this should have worn out from the weather long ago. And I'm told Aaron or the Bellevue College Asian American community. Fortunately, other organizations check out the new exhibit at the Bellevue Art Museum, Emerging Radiance, where artists Michelle Kumata and Tani Ikeda have created a mural and immersive storytelling experience that honors the story of the pre-war Japanese-American farmers in Bellevue, which is a whole nother story that you want to look into, right? There's a book, a very good book, that names the name that was removed from Aaron Chigaki's artwork 2 years ago, and all the names of those who profited from the expulsion of Japanese Americans from Bellevue, Strawberry Days, by David Newart. It's out of print, really hard to find, but you can put a hold on a copy at the King County Library System. I just checked last night. So in closing, we've seen how false accusations of disloyalty have historically been made in America solely on the basis of race. Race was the only characteristic common to the 120,000 people locked up in World War II, 7,000 from here in the Seattle area. And, race continues to divide us today. Unfortunately, the same elements of fear and ignorance of the other that opened the book are present today. Our book opens with the FBI knocking on the door to arrest our grandparents. It ends with ICE breaking down the door to deport immigrants. The book opens with fear of an attack from the Pacific, right? Pearl Harbor. Just 2 years ago, we had a president who dog whistled China virus and Kung flu from the White House at the start of the global pandemic. And today, people feel free to kick and punch Asians on the street. Takeaway is obviously some people things haven't changed. Takeaway is that we still see this kind of nativism and xenophobia continue today, to the point where candidates for office can actually win public support by appealing to the latent xenophobia and nativism of some Americans. In the book, we quote examples from World War II. This tweet is just a random example, happens to be handy. We should not allow, this is a Republican candidate, right? We should not allow Chinese nationals into our colleges where they can obtain classified information, steal technology, and essentially learn how to defeat the US. What these kinds of dog whistles and outright attacks achieve has a name, and the name is stochastic terrorism. Stochastic in everyday language means random. Terrorism here refers to violence motivated by ideology. So stochastic terrorism is the public demonization of a people or a group resulting in the incitement of a violent act, which is statistically probable, but whose specifics cannot be predicted. In other words, no one can say whether an Asian woman who was clubbed by a man in the ID in Chinatown or pushed on a subway in New York City was influenced, whether that act was influenced by something a president said 2 years ago. You can't link the two. And yet the statistics are showing numbers of these attacks in the time since we heard China virus and Kung flu, and said with such a sneering tone of voice. It could not be predicted who in specific would hear those words and have their own angers unleashed but it was just statistically probable. And we're seeing these numbers now. So, and the victims are become targets for no reason other than their race. Same as my father at age 17, who was viewed as an enemy alien and having his life interrupted and changed for no reason at all other than his race in 1942. So Sonny, I'll end it there and turn it back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Frank. That your short summary of your book, it really gives a perspective on those who have to fight for their own loyalty, those who fight to earn that loyalty from their country, and those who have to fight the country to show that they should be loyal. And there's this idea that there has to be a fight. And that's such an odd concept when you shouldn't have to fight to be loyal. So, and you mentioned that now, since the start of our situation with COVID, there has been a giant surge of violence towards people of color, not just Asian Americans, but they're just people of color that was treated as foreigners, or as many also known as the other or non-Americans. In your opinion, do you think that because World War II is a giant event that could not be replicated again or should not be replicated again, and hopefully COVID is an event that will not be replicated again, do you think that with all the violence and all the discrimination we face today, is it a history repeating itself, or was this just, it was going to happen eventually, and this, what we're facing today is just an excuse for the discrimination?
Yeah, I understand, Sonny. I mean, my thoughts on that are that, we had hoped with the election of a black president, what, 10 years ago, that we had achieved a post-racial society, that things are different now. We're past race. And as we've learned the hard way, all it took was a simple change in leadership at the top of our nation to unleash the nativism and hate and fear of the other that was apparently always there. And so, and it only needed sanction. Only needed permission to come forth. So, yes, what we saw with the reaction to Kung Flu is no different, and is a repetition of what happened with after Pearl Harbor in the U.S. And it only takes a different set of circumstances for others, not Japanese Americans next time, but it'll be somebody else. Right now, as I showed you in that one tweet from Texas, it may very well be Chinese American and students from China who become targeted in some, who are caught in the middle of some crazy conflict, trade, technological or otherwise, with the People's Republic. We saw with 9/11, after the attacks on the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001, that people of Arab American, Iranian American, or quite frankly, anyone with of South Asian descent with dark skin was targeted for beatings and attacks as a way to retaliate on a personal level for 9/11. And of course, I haven't really touched upon the asylum seekers from Central America, South America, who were and still are in many cases being held in family detention camps at the southern border. So this is part of our American history. It's not easy to look at, but I appreciate that. We need to talk about it and look at it and deal with it. And it's only by looking at it and dealing with it that we can do something about it. But my friend Tommy Ketta at Densho says, if history is not necessarily repeating itself, it certainly has a way of rhyming. History does rhyme, and our times are certainly rhyming with that of 1942. Never again is now is obviously another manifestation of that. I mean, we had said over the last 40 years, um, thankfully, this must never happen again. Incarceration of Japanese Americans, mass roundup based on race, must never happen again, and we must be vigilant, and never again. With the last administration in the White House and the Muslim travel ban and the family detention camps and family separations, we could no longer say that. We had the message shifted to never again. Oh my God, it's now, it's happening. We didn't prevent it. We didn't stop it. And that is the reality we're dealing with now. So we must keep our eyes open, Sunny.
I understand, and I completely agree. And we know about this. We know American history, and we know the current events of what's happening in America. But there's, like is said in the book, it's a luxury, it's a privilege to be in America. There is a lot of things that we can do here in America that can change the world, that can give people opportunities to be the best they can be. But there's also the darker side of America, which ostracizes, it discriminates, it mocks certain people purely based on what they were born with or who they were born as. So it really brings up the idea of loyalty. What,
Yes.
like, do you want to be loyal? Even I'm thankful to be in America, but at the same time, the treatment that I sometimes receive, makes me question it every day. And it brings up, do I want to be loyal? It gives me that question every day.
Well, and this is the tricky thing is that, we're emphasizing loyalty because you had raised the issue to me. What happened in the Japanese American response to incarceration was an overreaction where we had a leadership called the JACL, an organization which still exists today, which became super patriotic and went, in my opinion, overboard in their protestations of loyalty, to the point where they were pushing the draft of Nisei men in camp, when a lot of Nisei men were saying, wait, we don't. You can go ahead and volunteer, you guys, but don't force me to go serve in the army when I don't feel that's the right thing to do. And so this book covers the story of Jim Okutsu and others at Hard Mountain who became draft resistors in protest against both the government and the JCL, I guess our own community leadership, saying, I'm loyal not to this government, but to the Constitution. And this government has betrayed the ideals of the Constitution by denying us due process and throwing us in these camps. So it's it's a question of who you're loyal to. It's a question of who you're loyal to. Haley Mandela asked the question of, what can I do to better educate myself on these events so I can know these more hidden U.S. histories? And the answer, Haley, is just read. Read every book that they try to ban. So when they try to ban the 1619 Project, read that. When Tennessee School Board tries to ban the Holocaust graphic novel, Maus, M-A-U-S, by Art Spiegelman, read that. There is a movement now in the U.S. to avoid exposing children in school children, secondary school, to the realities of American history, such as the incarceration, such as slavery, the institution of slavery, such as the civil rights movement. And so there are movements now to ban books, and this, I believe, is going to be the next kind of battleground, because it's a manufactured culture war, in my opinion. It's a completely cynical way to mobilize politically and to divide the nation, even as they try, even as the claims are made that critical race theory, is dividing the country. No, it's these divisive concepts, divisive legislation that is dividing the country. I'm told there are now laws being passed or discussed in 37 states for some form of surveillance of teachers in the classroom, recording them, monitoring them, censoring their materials, and disciplining them for making white children feel bad or feel guilty or blaming white children in class for the actions of the past. And I'm going to drop a link into the chat to the national National Coalition Against Censorship that rebuts attempts to limit teaching related to racism, gender, and critical race theory under a broad umbrella of divisive concepts. So I just dropped a link in the chat to a nonpartisan statement that outlines 5 key reasons to oppose divisive concepts bills. That again, 37 states looking at them. Fortunately, Washington State is not one of them, but bad ideas, harmful ideas like deadly viruses will eventually cross state lines. And so this is something that I really want to keep an eye on in the coming months.
It really does bring up the question, what are you finding? What are the information that they're giving to you, and what are the information they're hiding? Banned books, you need to question, why are they being banned in the first place? What is the reasoning behind hiding this information that was supposedly published? You have to go through a bunch of stuff to get something published, but to ban it for what reason? And there's just so much hidden information and history that people have banned successfully, to the point that we're not so sure what's real and what's not. People have heard of the yellow peril, that word, but there's so much behind that word that people don't understand because no one talks about it or hides it. You also have 442, which is very much in line with what we're talking about. Would you like to share with us your opinions on that, Frank?
Well, now you're speaking about the Nisei volunteers and draftees who served in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. They served with valor, but their sacrifice was meant to be a way of winning public opinion, of winning getting the public on our side, to again show that we're just as American as everyone else. But it did not address the constitutional issues raised by camp. But only the draft resistors raised the constitutional issues by going to court and losing. But they raised the issues. The valor of the soldiers was brave. They were brave young men, but it did not directly address the constitutional issues. By the way, we were talking about banned books earlier, and the librarian mentions that you can borrow banned or challenged books from the Bellevue College Library. So Haley can just ask the librarian to get those books.
Yes,
and I would say Aisha asked the question, do I believe students should learn about discrimination in America at an early age or no? And I encourage you to watch John Oliver, Last Week with John Oliver, last Sunday. It's on YouTube. It has a great breakdown on critical race theory. And one answer to the question of should students learn about discrimination in America at an early age is the quick comeback is students of color already learn about discrimination at a very early age, whether they like it or not. Students of color are singled out, and experience racism at an early age. So it's better to talk about it in the classroom, secondary schools or elementary school, to talk about it as a group in a way that's, non-threatening to everyone, but to address it fairly, because it's already happening, and no no legislation can stop that from happening.
Mhm. Yeah, and I deal with kids pre-K, and they already have questions and a sort of understanding of what's going on around them. So you can't hide this forever. And to my comment on that, I'll have to say is if you're not going to teach these children or these students about what's going on and what's facing your country, then what are you going to teach them? What is more important than what's happening now? What are you hiding them for? And it's going to hurt them in the future.
Yeah, there are people who are in this country who are very afraid of an accurate history, and so it's even in my own community, it's been a struggle for me to bring out the subject of resistance to the camps. Just 20 years ago, you could not talk in polite Japanese American society about the draft resistors, the no-nos, the renunciants, especially the renunciants, um, because it was just there was a prevailing narrative in my community that it was the valor of the Nisei soldiers and the passive resignation of the others. You know, shikatakanai, passive resignation to injustice, or go for broke, patriotic self-sacrifice to prove we're American, were the only two acceptable narratives, and we just didn't talk about the draft resistors. And so that's been a struggle for me, and doing this book was another struggle to bring out the story of the Chile Lake renunciants. So, but it's worth it. It's worth it. Thank you. Any
Mhm.
more questions, Sunny?
Well, Leslie did bring up something interesting in the chat. How do you choose which story to tell? I was like, what do you do to counter the Asian stereotype that we have now? So it is an interesting question. There's so many stories to tell, and sometimes it's going to be different regardless of who you talk to. So how do you end up knowing which one is best?
Well, the answer to that is to tell the story that you know, the story and the story you have a passion for. You know, I can't imagine who asked the questioner's experience, but if they have I'm sure they have an experience that. Well, Leslie asked the question, so you know. Um, um, well, first tell the stories that haven't been told before, the untold stories, and you know there are many different stories. For example, like students who are targeted now on campuses for being Chinese or Chinese American and being suspected, or looked askance at for, stealing secrets or spying for China. I've not seen a story told from that point of view, through their eyes, what is their experience? There was a famous, notorious case of the Chinese scientist Wen Ho Li. This is maybe a decade, 2 decades ago, who was famously held up in the media as someone who was accused of being a Chinese spy. And I don't know the details of that story. I think there's maybe been a book about him, but again, stories like that would be the stories you want to tell, the stories that go against the prevailing attitudes of the nation, but also a counter to the vested interests of the Asian American community. I mean, there may be Chinese Americans who don't want to look at the Wen Ho Li story. Um, uh, Affirmative action. I mean, there is a huge again a manufactured controversy around affirmative action, led by this joker Ed Blum, who's getting Chinese students to speak out against affirmative action, which is just crazy to me. And I mean, that'd be a great story to tell about, kind of, take that apart, look at it, and find the truth there. Do a story between, someone a student who's appreciates and understands the benefits of affirmative action on college campuses, and a student who is vehemently against it. And just that'd be a very interesting play to do on stage, actually. Interesting idea you've given me. So there are just many stories. Look for points of friction. Interesting points of friction would be the story to pursue. That's a
That is
quote from Aaron Sorkin, but yeah.
no, that is a very interesting idea because I'm pretty sure many of us, we would prefer not to go for conflict. We don't want to disturb anyone. We don't want to harm anyone. We don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. But
Oh yeah,
you,
no, I took a big risk with this graphic novel because I not just step on toes, I trample on the sacred cows in the Japanese American community, which is the JECL and the Nisei veterans, who are very well organized. Um, but in the case of Nisei veterans, I handle that story with a great deal of respect. We have a character in the graphic novel who is a friend of Jimakutsu's, who does want to go serve in the army, who does want to be drafted, and loses a leg in combat, comes back, and then Jim greets him warmly at the Wame Club. It's in the last half of the book, and then discovers that he lost his leg serving in the army, and you know. As a matter of fact, that character, Keith Yamaguchi's father, Shiro Yamaguchi, was a real person we put in a graphic novel, and he was the model for the character of Kenji in the landmark novel No Boy by John Okada, which I also encourage Haley to read. No Boy by John Okada. The one-legged veteran Kenji is in the graphic novel. It's based on Shiro Yamaguchi, and his stories in our graphic novel. I'm glad for that.
so thank you so much for your input on this, and I hope it encourages us to. We will still try to respect people. We will still try to be as polite as we can, but let's politely trample on them. It's the best that I could say.
Yes, yeah. Puncture the sacred cows.
Well, I believe we only.
And Sunny's muted herself, so well, you've muted yourself, Sunny, but you're trying to say thank you.
Oh, someone else muted me, but
You're back now. You're back.
yeah, I don't know what happened, but oops. Well, yes, we only have a few minutes left. I want to say thank you, Frank, for giving us an insight and your perspective and just this amazing book that I hope that those who have managed to get a copy or will get a copy soon will, really appreciate what it is.
And you're holding 2 copies in the library too, as well, in your personal library, I guess.
I will have 3 personal copies in my office at the Resource Center here in Bellevue College, and there is 2 copies currently in the library's possession here at Bellevue College. And they also have a copy of the No Boys, which you mentioned, and Strawberry Days. So, students, you have no excuse. You have the resources, so use them.
I love librarians. Thank you, Becky Trumbull. Thank you.
Yes. And do you have anything that you would like to say to us students? Because as you said before, the people in the book we are probably the same age as them, just or around that age. Is there anything that you would like to say to us?
You face challenging times ahead. Just just know that there is a long history of Asian American students at Bellevue College, Seattle colleges. I did a whole talk for Seattle College about the number of Nisei students from Broadway High School who went on to shape Japanese American history. My only advice is just know that you have a place on campus, and don't let anyone try and take that away from you. And the place that you have was one that was built by the people I've described in the graphic novel, others in history, and you have support, and you have support from people like Leslie and others on campus. So don't let them make you feel small.
Thank you so much, Frank. So yes, this will be the end of our event. Thank you again for everyone who have managed to come in and have a chat with us or really have a really great listening ear. And for those who still would love to get this book, our registration form will still be open if you would like a copy. We still have a stock, but it is first come, first serve. So let's do it quick. Thank you, and have a good rest of the day.
Thanks everyone for tuning in. Really appreciate it. Thank you all. It was wonderful. I'm always amazed how people will stay with a talk for an hour when it's so sunny outside, even though it's cold. But it's nice and sunny outside. But it's really appreciate that.
It was very intriguing. No,